welcome to the Headache Doctor Podcast, where it's our mission to educate and empower everyone with headaches and migraines so that you can break free from a life of fear of your next headache or migraine and dependence on medication, allowing you to thrive in everything you do. All right, Lara, thanks for being on the podcast, on the Headache Doctor Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Jono.
Yeah, so I want you to, we have a lot that we have in common as far as both having our training as physical therapists and then finding this niche within our respective areas and leaning into that and really creating a product and something that's really valuable for people. And so that's why I think this conversation is going to be valuable for our listeners. But I want to start off with just giving our listeners background into who you are, maybe where your journey started, and if that starts as, in physical therapy school or before, I'll let you have the floor with just sharing who you are and how you became passionate about what you're passionate about.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm passionate about health and wellness and movement because it's life. I always say movement is life. It's really not something that should be an afterthought. And I think that is just hardwired in me because I grew up moving. I'm one of four. I have three brothers. I'm actually a triplet. So two boys and me came out at the same time, and we have an older brother. So we were like a little pack of movers. And at that time, a lot of the athletics, I'm kind of dating myself, but they weren't as welcoming to girls at the time. But I would join like the boys stuff, and I always played with my brothers. So I just love the kind of friendly competitiveness of it. I've loved the athleticism of moving my body and figuring out, different kind of coordinations and techniques for whatever sports. So that was hardwired. And I feel like that's an advantage for me in doing what I am now because I've never had to be convinced of it. Like it was just in my cells. And I also knew my dad was an orthopedic surgeon. So I grew up in a very inquisitive, intellectual, health-focused environment. And I went to school thinking that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon because I'd always been interested in the brain. My dad would talk a lot about neurology because he was really into quantum physics. He was like very much a well-rounded, intelligent human. And, some orthopods don't get that credit as that like ex-athlete, but he was really so remarkable. And so I was really inspired to do something in medicine and wellness. And I also just simultaneous to that had always been in fitness. My senior year in high school, I ran cross country kind of just because the coach asked me to, because my brother was really good. He's like, I think you're good too. And then I ended up running in college. But after my brother and I've told this story before sometimes, but my brother and I ran cross country, and then he said, once the season was over, hey, you want to run a marathon? I was like, sure. We had no training, and we just went and did it. And I actually wrote my college essay about that, and it was about the mind-body connection, really before, this is when I was 18 years old. I hadn't heard of yoga or this kind of mindfulness or anything, but again, I knew from a cellular level how integrated that is, how when you're moving, you feel different than when you're stagnant. And so, and we ran that, and the only way we made it was because of our mind. Like I knew that at like 21 miles, I wanted to give up. And I was young enough, I'd never prepared for it, and I don't recommend it, but it really is a mental thing. And we know this. Anytime you do any kind of rigorous endurance, something different, it is a lot of the mental challenge. So then I went to college and I decided not to go to med school because I really was like, the lifestyle is not going to be great. I saw my dad's, 8 to 8 every day and on call. And so I pivoted and decided to become a PT, mainly because someone had told me like, oh, you'd be a great PT. And I didn't really even know much about physical therapy. I'd never had it myself. Like a lot of PTs experience it, and like it was so, I'd never had that. But I was talking to my dad, and he said, I think it's a great thing, because I was thinking about physician's assistant, and he's like, no, Lara, you are way too dominant. This is not where you want to go. It's a very subordinate position. And he goes, PT is autonomous. You have your own control. It's you have great relationships and time that you can have with a client. And then I did, like, I think what you were mentioning, I shadowed, and I just thought, wow, they're having fun. This looks great,
Yeah.
And so I went to grad school for PT, and probably when I entered grad school, thought I was going to do sports medicine. Like I was talking to you about how you did soccer, and did you want to go into sports medicine? So, because that's what I was familiar with and knew. And then I went and got a great rehab job where I was working with older clients. I was working with neurologically impaired, and I loved it. It was a completely different population that I thought I would go toward. And then I was so into learning about, how we can help neurologically impaired clients. I went and got my specialization in what's called neurodevelopmental training, which is really looking at how we can neuroplasticity, how we can rewire movement after there's been damage to the brain, or just through habits. And so that is my background, and got really into that. And at the same time, I was teaching aerobics. I got certified in yoga. I discovered yoga and really loved it, and really got into teaching yoga. And after I've been teaching for about 5 or 6 years, I was at the same time working with really neurologically impaired clients, like stroke patients. And I had one, and I was doing all the stuff on the floor, all of those developmental stages. Mm-hmm. Because you get so much feedback from the floor, you get some support for the center of gravity, and you can really go into that hard wiring of the brain from those early patterns that we developed when we were going from the womb and then to being bipedal. And you can tap into that again and help, the rewiring of some of the areas that have been damaged. So he and many others were making incredible strides in what we were doing. And I thought, well, what would it be like if I applied this to an able-bodied person, right? Because we all have some kind of habitual patterns that just occur. I mean, if you're sitting at a desk, studying, how grad school is, we're in it. And there's not a lot of movement variability. And with that, there can be some compensations and some postural imbalances, et cetera. So could I, in fact, apply those principles to my able-bodied self and see what would happen? So I did that, and my own practice really just changed dramatically in terms of the control, in terms of the postural control, the proximal control, the responsiveness of my core, meaning I could practice in a more advanced way, but not just for the sake of it, not for celebration, like a gold star, but how it felt. And so I started just weaving that into my practice and teaching, and slowly created what is now called the LIT method, which is combining my physical therapy background with yoga poses and some principles, really to create this kind of comprehensive movement experience that ultimately is there to help rewire and reinforce better movement patterns for life, because we want to be moving well for a long time. So There it is in a nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So a few things jumped out to me that I think are, if I'm going to play that back to you with some highlights, you talked about this mind-body connection. So I want to dig into that a little bit more. And also the term neuroplasticity. I personally talk about our central nervous system and how we respond to pain. And so whether I've used that term or not, it's something that we talk a lot about on this podcast. And so maybe let's just start with defining neuroplasticity and what that means in the neurological system, because a lot of my listeners are not coming from a medical background, but this neuroplasticity thing is so cool. And I think that if I were going to sum up what you're passionate about, it's just seeing this sort of revelation or the impact of neuroplasticity on the body and movement and how we incorporate it to day-to-day life.
Yeah. So neuroplasticity is basically the concept that the brain and the nervous system can change. It's not rigid. It used to be thought, and not that far ago, not that long ago, within, I would say, the past half century, that, most of your brain development happened until about age 8. And after that, there was not a lot of things that would change it. And that's kind of like a bummer to think about. Like anything you learn, knowledge, apply, challenge is not going to necessarily change the brain. Well, of course, they realize that's not true. There are things that can make it more challenging because when you're learning something for the first time, like those developmental things, those are actually so you're growing the brain through our movement. So our going from this kind of helpless floppy baby to being bipedal required these developmental stages where we developed the postural control and muscles and coordination, and we were growing the brain. So the gray matter of the brain, 80% of it is involved in movement, which is a huge amount. It's also involved in memory and processing. So, through movement, what neuroplasticity shows is that we can change the brain, we can grow the brain, we can make the brain more intelligent. And I don't mean like academically intelligent. I mean that the connections, the wiring are stronger and reinforced and more complex. So, there's complex networking of these neurons that string together. And the more we challenge that we grow it. And that's the idea of neuroplasticity is we can adapt and we can change. Anything that is going to evolve or grow has to have challenge placed on it. And that's the same with the brain. So if you're doing the same thing, not really reading much, just kind of what you're not really going to change the brain a lot. If you want to grow the brain to make it more adaptable, more intelligent, and really that responsiveness I talk a lot about too, and I'm sure you do as well, this communication of body and brain and systems to the brain, because the brain is basically the CEO in charge of everything. And so we want our CEO to be adaptable, not sitting back, feet up on the table drinking coffee and not changing anything when things aren't working well, And so that neuroplasticity just gives us hope, and that's, I think hope for change is probably more powerful medicine than almost anything. And that's the problem when you deal with people with chronic pain or a chronic condition. They can get that kind of rigid mindset. This will never be different. And it might not be if you don't kind of change in this form of neuroplasticity. So I think just knowing that potential's there is amazing.
Yeah, I love that. As you're talking, one of the things that I try to do is sort of like remove. So in our education, both for me, it was exercise science as an undergrad, and then going through the physical therapy degree. There's almost a basic level of understanding of like the body and how it moves and the adaptations or compensations that we get ourselves into. And so talking about neuroplasticity, and I think you did this so well, but our brains, as you explained, our brains sort of intuitively, I think people think, can be challenged academically. And obviously we know we're trying to get smarter. We're trying to retain information. We're trying to learn how to problem solve. Those things are intuitive for people. I think what's not intuitive is thinking about our musculoskeletal system as really needing to adapt. I mean, everyone's got a shoulder. Everyone has these muscles. The muscles contract and relax. There's cartilage, there's ligaments, there's tendons. Like what are we talking about when we talk about adapting or changing, or how does the brain really change something? And you use the term proximal, the core, the parts of our body that allow us to be stable. What needs to change there? What's the problem that's happening?
Oh, wow. That's, I think the number one problem that is, I think the most obvious one is we aren't moving enough in a variety of ways. And that movement variability, just think of it as like this beautiful, complex ecosystem that we can move in a variety of ways. That's how our body, was engineered to do. And the brain responds to that. So it responds to, like, if I want to pivot really quickly on the soccer field or something, just like if I were slipping down the stairs, I want my nervous system to respond to that because that would be safe, right? But it's also responsive in that I can move in the ways that I want, as I want, when I want. And that requires that we train those movement patterns. We train the variability. And our modern day lifestyle doesn't lend itself to that. You know, when we started, if you look at children, for instance, we always think of like, look what you could do when you were kids. Well, the reason is they were free. They were moving around until they went to school, and then they were sitting. And then it's not just the sitting, it's the sitting and staying stationary for long periods, year after year after year. And then what do you do after college? Well, you graduate and you get a job. And a lot of those jobs are doing the same thing. So you're just dulling all that great information into the brain that challenges it. Movement variability, load, endurance. All of that is being dulled because you don't have to work. Like, we are also, at the same time, from a very my undergrad was biological anthropology and anatomy. So, I mean, it's very fascinating to look at like evolution and how there's certain things that have changed that really had to do with our lifestyles changing. So we were really not made to be stationary, and our brain doesn't respond to that either. Like, no one can really be, and they've shown this, like the cortex, we're not going to stay like alive and perky for long periods of time. So productivity is like this kind of false umbrella. You're going to be more productive when you actually get up, move around, shake things up, get your blood flowing, your heart rate, and then coming back and then focusing. Your brain is like refreshed. It's like it got a little heartbeat up there, So I think the biggest problem is lifestyle. And lending to that, when you are stationary for long periods of time, you don't, even though you're doing very little, there's very little required in your core, those proximal stabilizers, because you're kind of sitting in a chair and, your center of mass is supported, you've got something behind. All those things are dulled down. And ironically, you're not doing anything, but you get tired. And that, to me, is the biggest signal. Like, if we're doing nothing, like I tell people all the time, think about like when you're in an airplane and you fly somewhere and then you get there, how tired you are after flying. You've done nothing but sit in people could say, well, the air pressure. No, it's that you've been stagnant. And the first instinct is maybe to go to your hotel and take a nap,
right?
Right? Because your energy is dulled. There's been no input into the brain that's just a challenge to it. So I think it's the way our life is set up, and obviously many of us are fighting that because we intuitively know that doesn't feel great. I mean, and I'm sure you're the same way. One thing I loved about PT is I knew it wasn't going to be a desk job. I knew it's going to be active, and that was really, really important to me from a young age. I was like, I could not sit at a desk. And it's not that I'm antsy, it's that I don't want to be stagnant.
Yeah. So it's almost as if we need to give our body an education as well as our mind. And through the education we provide to our body, meaning just inserting movement, our mind benefits from it.
Yes.
I'm also wondering, so you have a program that obviously uses your PT background, this mind-body connection background in the neuroscience department, working with neurorehab, and then you've come up with specific routines. But in general, and I think I'm going to make an assumption here, but I think a lot of what you're saying is that general movement is good. Like, you don't need to have a PhD in movement.
No.
To do this. It's sort of like giving your body what it intuitively wants. Is that correct?
Exactly. Are you talking about like what I teach, for instance?
Well, I'm talking about in general, just so that people have this context.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, I always want to welcome people into the whole the environment of movement by saying it does not have to be like when I go to corporate settings. Mm-hmm. My first question will be, how many of you feel like you're moving enough in your daily life? The percentages are so low, it's scary, right? And then the second question I say, how many of you think of movement as a checklist or something that's even slightly punitive, right? Like, oh gosh, I got to do this, I got to exercise, I got to run. And I said, what I want to do is invite you to think of movement as life. And that means that movement will give you more life, more energy in your life, more vitality if you just insert it a little bit more. And so I would rather have somebody move 5 to 10 minutes out of every hour than go 8 hours at a desk and go to the gym for an hour, because that's not bad, that's good, but it's still, you're not going to undo those 8 hours. Whereas those 5 to 10 minutes inserted are going to have a kind of a compound interest effect, right? They're going to just add up, because you're never going to have to go like from contracted, undo it, and then contract it again. And a lot of times too, this will lead me into why my program is different than, say, other yoga, for instance. But if you go to the gym after sitting for 8 hours and you just go and do a routine, your body is coming in as present, meaning contracted, compressed. Therefore, your brain is also in a different kind of starting place for that movement. So if you just go into a routine and you haven't like done a little bit of unwinding, preparatory stuff from what you've been doing sitting for 8 hours, the impact of that movement isn't going to be kind of much for the brain either.
Yeah. As far as now we can talk about more of the specifics, because you have this amazing platform with video content, specific movements that people can incorporate. Maybe let's talk about the what traditional yoga is, and how you've sort of complemented that with your background in physical therapy, and what does that practically look like?
Well, I love that question. So I was practicing and originally introduced to more kind of a traditional, meaning it's just the style that was more universally, I guess, practiced and approached. And the way a lot of people looked at yoga is like, this is the way to do it. And it's like so I was doing vinyasa, and you started the class and you start moving, and then everything was in like this certain way. Like you do some standing leg stuff. And then anyway, to me, as I looked at it from a PT standpoint, it was like, it didn't make sense from a sequencing, like neurological sequencing perspective. And the reason being is, again, we're coming into our practice on the mat with our own imbalances. We all might have them, right? And it could be just from a couple hours before, it could be like from decades before. So we need to better set up our body to rewire better movement patterns, because our brain is going to only kind of take a track that it knows well. So for example, if I'm sitting a lot, I might have, my shoulders might be rounded, or I might have a lot of like feelings of neurological tension in the front of my pelvis. I go and I start moving on the mat. Well, those are still there. So I probably just habitually adjusted to, like, if I want my shoulders to come up, I can just push my ribs forward. And so instead of going into the movements and maybe reinforcing suboptimal habits, how about if we take some time at the beginning and reset this idea of neutral spine, neutral pelvis, how to integrate the core and breath, so that then when we move in bigger ways, we have more of a chance of rewiring that movement, meaning learning it differently, that then takes us into our life so we can move differently. So that's a huge difference, is the sequencing of the LIT method. And because I really ultimately want people to move better in life, not just for an hour on the mat. So we're using the mat as an educational platform. I'm a PT, I developed it. I have a lot of PTs who also are on our platform, but I have over 800 teachers worldwide who've been trained by me, and they understand it. And a lot of times their students will think they're physical therapists, because this is the thing I'll say. You don't have to be a PT to understand your body. Everybody should understand their body. They should understand why, knowing how to be in a more optimal alignment. Optimal is not a static position. It's a spectrum that, again, is setting up your nervous system for a more intelligent response. If your posture isn't great, there's lots of repercussions of that. You're not going to breathe as well. Well, if you're not breathing as well, you're probably going to get more exhausted. You might go, You might actually breathe in a way that makes you more anxious. There's lots of kind of sequela from the way your starting position is. So in LIT, we always start with what's called the reset. And that's where we revisit those developmental patterns. We're on our back. We get our hips extended without tipping the pelvis, get the core integrated, establish neutral spine, neutral pelvis, and then start mobilizing some of the big synovial joints to prepare them for bigger movement patterns, which we then tack on. So sequencing to me is when it's really, really important because, it wasn't as necessary when we were younger and just like spongy and could take it all in. But we all have things that we might be a little bit more pre-wired to in ways we might move or stand or breathe, and we can change that. Again, it's that neuroplasticity.
Yeah, I love how you said the education happens on the mat, and then it translates into the day-to-day life. So maybe if traditional yoga is a little bit more segmented, and you're in class or you're not in class. I mean, yoga with the mindfulness and breathing, and I feel like people that are participating in yoga are much more aware of their bodies. Mm-hmm. But yes. I love that you're taking it to, like, you're infusing this element of education. And so we talk a lot about empowering people with headaches and migraines, and it sounds like that's right up that alley of like empowerment. How can you make these little changes throughout your day? And it starts with a better understanding, right? Just what does your body need? How is it supposed to be? How can you cater to it? If you're on the fast food diet and you're trying to transition to whole foods, like what does that transition look like from a sedentary lifestyle to movement? I think that's really amazing. How can people interact with you? I know you've got a podcast, your website, you've got a lot of avenues. So maybe let's talk about free things and things that will take you to the next level.
Yes, and just on that note, empower is another word I love too, that we use a lot, because education is empowerment. Not understanding your body and then leaving it up to the medical system to tell you what is going on